Let's get started. This webinar is being recorded, and there is an ASL interpreter available for anyone with accessibility needs. Please leave a message in the chat if you can't see the interpreter, and we'll try to adjust the screen. Good afternoon. This is the National Council for Preservation Education's Summer Webinar Series, the second of 4 informational sessions held in July on topics important to the Federal Historic Preservation Program. I'm Julee Johnson, the Director of NCPE's Internship Program and the moderator of the webinars. This series is offered by NCPE in collaboration with the National Park Service and the assistance of NPS's Cultural Resources, Partnerships, and Science Directorate. We have 3 panelists speaking today on the theme of tribal relations. We'll cover climate change and the Great American Outdoors Act of 2020 in webinars later this month. I first want to welcome all the NCPE interns, associates, and fellows from other organizations and federal agencies, NPS employees, and anyone else attending. I'm delighted you can participate and look forward to your questions and comments, which I invite you to put into the chat at any time. Before I introduce our panelists and my co-hosts from NPS, I want to take a moment to explain who the members of the National Council for Preservation Education are and what they do. As I mentioned during last week's webinar, NCPE is a nonprofit membership organization of academic programs that offer degrees in historic preservation, heritage conservation, and cultural resource management. There are about 60 institutional members of NCPE located at universities and colleges across the country, as this map of the United States shows. Here I've highlighted a few of the institutions to pinpoint where they are and the range of degrees that they offer, from associates to bachelor's to master's to certificates. While each program has similar core courses, each one emphasizes or prioritizes different aspects of the field. For example, the Savannah College of Art and Design offers studio-based instruction and really stresses design and adaptive reuse, often using Savannah's National Historic Landmark District as its laboratory in the field. The University of New Mexico's Historic Preservation and Regionalism certificate emphasizes regional history, smart growth, and cultural content in its coursework. The University of Oregon's degree programs, both undergraduate and graduate, highlights experiential learning that meshes academics with its field school, where students learn about building materials and hands-on construction. And at the University of Mary Washington's undergraduate degree, it's a multidisciplinary program with coursework offered in subject areas that include museum studies, archaeology, and urban planning. Depending on where a student is in their life, whether looking for a 1-year certificate to burnish other credentials or searching for an immersive 2- or 4-year experience, there's a program that will meet their needs. NCPE peer reviews its members to ensure each meets basic academic standards and requires practical experience, such as completing an internship. The complete list of members can be found at ncpe.us under academic programs, where you can find links to these programs and application materials. Just a point of information, to apply for an NCPE internship, you don't have to be a student or a recent graduate of these programs. Any accredited institution of higher learning is eligible. Now I'd like to introduce my co-host, Paloma Bolasny, the Youth Programs Coordinator at the NPS Cultural Resources Office of Interpretation and Education in Washington, D.C. Paloma is responsible for assembling the speakers for this webinar series. I want to thank you, Paloma, for joining me and ask if you want to say a few words.
Sure. Thank you, Julie. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Paloma Bolasny. I am the Youth Programs Coordinator for the Cultural Resources Directorate at the National Park Service's Washington office. And I work in the Cultural Resources Office of Interpretation and Education. And I work with Julie in administering the NCPE Internship Program. I want to thank today's speakers, Kim, Eric, and Mary, for volunteering to participate and sharing their expertise with everyone today. I have some accessibility announcements that I want to relate to everyone, some really good tips. So one, keep your mic muted unless you're speaking. Use the raise hand feature instead of speaking unannounced. When speaking, have your video on. Introduce yourself when speaking. For example, say, "This is Paloma speaking," and then speak slowly, but don't talk like a whale. Don't talk too slowly, that is. If you would like to access our live transcript or closed captioning, there should be a button that says live transcript on your icon bar in Zoom. You can enable closed captioning and also modify the size of the captions under subtitle settings. And so with that, I'll turn it over back to you, Julie, for our first speaker.
Thank you, Paloma. This is Julie Johnson speaking. Thank you for those important reminders and for your time and your energy in putting together the entire webinar series. We have 3 panelists today speaking on various topics related to our theme of tribal relations. You may put any questions for them in the chat and we'll respond after each presentation. There will also be time at the end of the session for more Q&A. I will also provide contact emails for all speakers at the end, as well as information about our next webinars in the series. Finally, all of the sessions will be uploaded with closed captioning to NCPE's YouTube channel, which can be found by searching YouTube by the organization's full name, National Council for Preservation Education. Okay, the first speaker today is Kim Greenwood. Kim assumed the acting manager position for the Tribal Historic Preservation Program last fall in October 2021. This program supports tribes that apply to assume certain functions from the state historic preservation officers as outlined in the National Historic Preservation Act. Her permanent position is with the regional cultural as the regional cultural anthropologist for the National Park Service Intermountain region, where she has served since 2013. Kim has worked for the federal government for 26 years and with tribes for 30 years. She's joined today by her NCPE intern, Hailey Doucette, a graduate student in history at Colorado State University. And at this point, I want to ask Kim if she wants to take over the screen. And there you are. Great. Take it away.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for your time today. I'm really excited to be here to tell you a little bit about this program and also to give you the opportunity to hear from Hailey about the project that she has been doing under her NCPE internship. So with that, I'd like to get started. In the chat, you should find the link to this particular website about our program. This is the homepage of our program. As Julie just mentioned, this program is established under the National Historic Preservation Act, and it was assigned to the National Park Service to administer the program. There are 574 federally recognized tribes, and of those tribes, those who meet the tribal lands definition as outlined in the law are welcome to apply for the assumption of certain state historic preservation office duties. There are 10 duties or functions outlined in the law, and most tribes assume between 7 and 9 of those functions. As of today, we have 209 tribal historic preservation officers. These are the ones who have gone completely through the entire program. And we have 4 who are far along in the process and should become official Section 101D TPOs by September 30th. So we're extremely excited about that. We at an average of 7 per year. And so we are on track to be close to or exceed the average there. When you are on this page, the first paragraph here explains a little bit about our particular program, pretty much what I've just shared with you. And then there are 6 boxes below, and I'd like to focus on a few of these boxes today. As I said, we have 209 TPOs or THPOs, Tribal Historic Preservation Officers is what TPOs stand for. And you can go to this link here in order to find a database, and you can look up a TPO if you know the tribe's name, or if you know the state, or if you know the last name of the person, then you can type it in here and search for that information. So it's a really nice database that many people use to find their particular person or tribe that they're looking for. The next box is the Thpo application. So if there is a tribe who is federally recognized and they meet the tribal lands definition that's in the law, they can click on this particular page here, and there is an application that they can click on this link and start filling out that application. We also have below here some specific training opportunities, some YouTube videos and checklists and information that a tribe can review in preparation for their application. This process is not just filling out a form and sending it in. It is also the development of a relationship between the tribal staff and the National Park Service staff. And so the application goes back and forth probably on average 3 times before it is considered in a final draft stage. And then it goes to external review, after which a memorandum of agreement is signed by the tribe and the National Park Service. There are a couple of boxes on here we won't talk about too much, but once a tribe has received official status under the law, there is a program called State Tribal Local Plans and Grants, or STILPIG for short. And this link here will take you to that program to find out more information about how to apply for grants. In the memorandum of agreement that is signed between the tribe and the National Park Service, the tribes are required to submit an annual accomplishments report. That information, the statistical information, is listed on this particular website. And then in 2017 was the 25th anniversary of the program. And this link here will take you to that report to see what the tribes had done in that 25 years. And at this time, I would like to turn the functionality over to Hailey Doucette. As Julie referred to, she is a master's in history student at Colorado State University. I'm very excited to have Hailey on. She's been doing an excellent job. And she's going to talk to you a little bit about her project here, the Vignettes of TPO Accomplishments. So at this time, I'm going to quit sharing and turn it over to Hailey. Thank you, Hailey.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to get my screen share up and take over from where Kim left off. So my main role as a NCPE intern has been creating vignettes based off the accomplishments reports that Kim mentioned. So annually, the Tribal Historic Preservation officers submit accomplishment reports to us, and my main role this summer has been reading through the accomplishment reports and looking for interesting work that tribes have done to highlight on our vignettes of Tribal Historic Preservation Officer accomplishments page on our website. This has looked like me reading through the reports, and then I reach out to the tribe to see if this is something that they're interested in doing. And then I like to have a conversation with them to get a little bit more information about the process of the accomplishments. And then I go through the process of drafting up a short vignette and work with the tribe to make sure that they are okay with how the vignette has turned out. And I also reach out to them to see if they have a picture that we can post with the vignette. So it's been really fun talking with the tribes and seeing visual images of the work they've been doing. One of my favorite vignettes that I did this summer, and the most recent one on our website, was highlighting the work of the Yurok tribe in California and their work to operate the first tribally operated California State Park Visitor Center. And on here we have the title of the vignette, an image of the opening, and then we've also added the functions on there that it meets under the Section 101D, the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer accomplishments. And then you'll find a short photo caption as well as the vignette that explains why this was important, the process of it, and a little overview of that accomplishment. We've been highlighting tribes from across the United States, so it has been really fun to see how different tribes have met their various historic preservation officer goals. And on this page, I will post a link to the vignette specifically in the chat in case anyone's interested in looking at some of the other vignettes that can be found on here. It's really interesting to read about all the different accomplishments of tribes. So, thank you. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen now.
I'm going to, I guess, go back here and share my screen again. Here we go. Thank you so much for that information. Do we have any questions in the chat for Hailey or for Kim? Paloma, I don't know if I saw any, but.
No, I don't. I don't see any questions in the chat, although Hailey did add a link to the accomplishments report. And early on, Kim did add a link to the Thpo program. So you can explore that further.
I do have a question, and that's about the functions that the tribes are able to accomplish. And for Kim or for Hailey, are there some functions that are more favored by a tribe to work on, or are there ones that are more difficult? I just wanted to get a sense of, or are they all over the map? Just wanted to get an idea about what the functions were and what's which ones are more prevalent among the tribes in the United States.
Hi, Julie. There are 10 functions, and in the back of the application, there is a list of those 10 functions. Most tribes assume between 7 and 9 functions, with the majority assuming 8 functions. The 2 functions that they tend not to assume have to do with tax credits and things that are more closely associated with states and tasks that tribes do not undertake. Every once in a while, a tribe will take on that tax credit program, but rarely. So when I can share my screen really quick, and I will show you in the application where to go to see those 10 functions.
Mhm.
So when we're in this application page, apply here. And when you scroll towards the end, there is an Appendix A, and it lists right here, you can see it lists the 10 functions. So most tribes assume functions 1 through 7. They tend to skip number 8. They assume 9, and they tend to skip number 10.
Well, thank you for that, Kim. That's really interesting information. And I think if we had more time, we could go into the whys and wherefores about it.
Sounds great. Thank
Yeah,
you.
I appreciate your thoroughness. Our next speaker is, this is Julie Johnson, by the way. Our next speaker is Eric Chaisson. Eric began working with the IR-1 Tribal and Cultural Affairs Office as a student field placement intern in May of 2020 until graduating from the UMass Dartmouth Law Program in May of 2021. Eric has a public policy background from the Muskie School of Public Service at the University of Southern Maine and experience serving as a paralegal non-commissioned officer in the Army JAG Corps. He was attracted to the National Park Service by its function as the nation's largest public educational corps and its special relationship to Indigenous peoples as a federal land managing agency. And I want to invite Eric to take over the screen.
Thank you, Julie.
Welcome.
Hello, everyone. This is Eric Chaisson. I am the Regional Tribal Liaison for Region 1 of the National Park Service. I hope you can see my screen. I'm going to start my presentation here. But before I describe sort of what's going on here in the map, I wanted to give start with a little bit of a background.
Eric, we don't see the map.
Oh, I haven't selected the screen. I'm sorry. Let's go. All right. Apologies, everyone.
There we go.
All right, wonderful. Okay. So here's my screen. So I wanted to start with just a little bit of background in, I guess we would say, federal Indian law that sort of sets up what it is that the role that I perform in the region. So under federal Indian law principles, there are a series of cases that have established a framework whereby tribal nations are considered domestic dependent nations, sort of the equivalence of state sovereigns, but preempted by federal sovereigns. This is important because, well, there are historical reasons for this, a long history of land displacement federal land predation and all of that sort of history that goes along with this work. But what it does is it establishes a duty of protection, and arising from that duty of protection is a federal obligation to consult, particularly, the federal land managing agencies will carry these responsibilities that flow from a body of federal Indian law, from the Constitution, series of executive orders, and different statutes and departmental and agency policy. So the map here that you all should see is our region, Region 1, and what it's sort of illustrating is one way that we could look at Region 1. Here we're showing should be approximately 47 tribal nations that are traditionally occupied spaces in our region are associated. 24 of which still are here in the region, but the obligation of the federal government, of the Park Service, and all of the parks in our region is to consult with all 47, whether they live there or not, for reasons related to sovereignty and cultural vitality that are all sort of captured in cultural resource law. So here's a map of our region. Sort of is an illustration of the 83 parks anyway. This particular map shows the 83 parks that are throughout our region. What it doesn't show though are over 1,000 national historic landmarks, about 50 national heritage areas, and some national scenic areas, all of which can become and often are a nexus where the federal government may have an obligation to consult with the tribal nations that are associated traditionally with that space when the federal government is undertaking an action that has implications for the tribe, cultural implications, or implications for other rights that they may have that might flow from treaties or different statutes, or just even are captured by DOI policy, which sometimes fills the gaps where the trust responsibility is not as explicit as we might like, but because it is in the interest of the department and it is expected to balance a series of competing interests. It's often the policy of the department to consult. So as the regional tribal liaison, my office serves as the program lead for tribal consultation. In that function, I provide support, advice, and interpretation of different policy initiatives that are a priority for the administration or for the secretary or the director. And so in this role, I support the regional director in certain instances. It's more typical that I'm interacting and supporting superintendents on a various assortment of Native affairs matters. Usually this advice is along the lines of Indian law or legislation or policy, or just different implications of for tribal communities. Again, just coming back to the core purpose of the office, right, is to ensure that the rights of sovereign nations are fully respected. So the program encompasses all government-to-government responsibilities in the region and provides that guidance related to those consultative working relationships at the park. This is often planning and development issues, compliance, resource use, exhibited interpretive programs, and sometimes boundary issues, and the process of dispute resolution, which is laid out in DOI consultation policy. Should there be a particular action that's undertaken by the department in consultation with the tribal nations, and there's some disagreement about what mitigation or avoidance might look like, or what respecting sovereignty might look like. There is a process, an avenue available to the nations to challenge an action in some instances. So as a liaison, that work is internal and external. The liaison is that go-between, often between parks, programs, and tribal nations. But equally, it's also the go-between in sort of facilitating communication between the regional office and the parks, or between the Washington office component of, so I sort of fall under the Office of Native American Affairs. So I liaise between that office at Washington, our region, and often the parks. And that's, again, related to issues of tribal relations as they concern interpretation, preservation of resources, development, and planning. Examples of that are things like facilities, trails and roads, and parks. These are pretty typical actions that they're going to require consultation. But there are others that they come in a lot of different forms. Another core function of that I perform is to provide that cultural competency expertise, because it's very easy for consultation to perhaps become unproductive if there's a cultural misunderstanding, right? And so that's a function that I perform as well. I'll often evaluate proposed plans as sort of a mechanism to assist parks in programs in alerting them to what might be some potential issues of concern, even before they approach tribal nations in consultation. And then, again, my role is to support parks and staff in building the capacity for tribal partnering. This is sort of an external function. Partnering the CESU network, that's Cooperative Ecosystem Study Unit. That's a research organization of parks and partners and tribal nations that often facilitates partnering and has the benefit of offering less administrative costs that sometimes come with these kind of partnership arrangements. The program also coordinates education and training for staff to assist with effective tribal working relationships. The more typical training that all parks are expected to get for their staff that participate in consultations is the DOI universities consulting with tribal nations. But in the future, we intend to offer other beneficial trainings that will help assist parks in raising cultural competencies in areas that will be helpful for doing important work that they would like to be doing around social justice, cultural justice, ecological justice type issues. Lastly, I may find myself recommending new initiatives. This is often informed by policy that it comes out of events like this past fall. We had a White House Council of Native American Affairs Tribal Summit, where we saw the administration lay out its priorities in the area of Native Affairs and the different departments, to include the Department of Interior. Also announced a series of secretarial priorities there. So usually, you know, an initiative would be related to one of these policy priorities. The picture here is of Katahdin Woods and Waters National Monument up in northern Maine. This is a very interesting and exciting new park in the system that has been donated by a private philanthropic organization that also entered into consultation of its own accord with the Wabanaki Nations of Maine in designing a visitor contact station. So this was a great example of what consultation can result in and what the future of co-management or co-stewardship could look like. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and refer it back to Julie.
All right. I'm going to ask Paloma, do we have any questions? I don't know if I saw any in the chat.
Yes, this is Paloma. We have a comment. If the slide, the graphic can be shared with the participants. The comment was this, and I think they're referring to the first few slides of the map, that this is a really clear and valuable visual resource. So Julie, I don't know if via Zoom you can share, or if Eric can just email, or we can email interested participants a copy of the slides.
We have all the registrants' emails, so we could send it out. Sorry, this is Julie. Go ahead, Eric.
Hi, this is Eric. I think there's no reason we can't share these, and I think that they're actually also available on a regional SharePoint site. So I can provide that as in the chat as well.
Thank you. Is there a public site with this information as well?
That's a great point. This, I would hope it would be available to our NCPE interns, but if not, why don't we just play it safe and send it through email? Okay,
sure. So all participants can get it via the Zoom follow-up. We do have a question. Eric, when do tribes enter into an MOA, and when do they enter into an MOU? What is the difference between the two from a tribal perspective?
This is Eric. I think at a basic level, the difference between the two would be that an MOA is used to move money to the tribe. An MOU might be just related to services or park operations, but it's not an instrument that's used to move funds.
Thank you for clarifying that distinction. Good question. Any other questions for our speakers? You can pop them in at any time and we'll get to them. And you can always ask at the end as well. Hopefully we'll have a minute or two left for some Q&A. But if there aren't any additional questions, Julie, I guess we can move on.
All right.
Mary.
Thank you very much, Eric. That was great. And to Paloma for fielding questions. Our next and last speaker is Mary Carroll. Mary is the program manager of the Park Nagpra program, which provides technical and compliance assistance about the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, Nagpra, to all national park sites and offices throughout the United States. Mary has a master's degree in anthropology, specializing in archaeology, from the Arizona State University, and started with MPS at the National Center for Preservation Technology and Training. After NCPE, Mary moved to what was then the NPS Archaeology and Ethnography program in Washington, D.C., and took on NPS-wide Nagpra coordination duties. She helped build the Park Nagpra program when it was implemented in 2005 and has been the program manager since 2013. So Mary, I'm hoping that you can share your screen.
I'm hoping I can too. Thank you, Julie. Hold on a second. Sorry, just trying to get the right monitor. So,
Perfect, thanks.
okay, great. Thank you, Julie, and thank you for the opportunity to share a very brief overview of my program. As Julie said, I'm the program manager of the Park Nagpra program, and Nagpra stands for Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. And my program helps parks and offices across the United States meet the law's requirements. Before I get into what we do, I want to start with a short overview of what the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act is. It was enacted on November 16th of 1990 and applies to federal agencies and museums. The law requires the return of Native American human remains and certain cultural items, specifically funerary objects, sacred objects, and objects of cultural patrimony that are in collections or are newly discovered on federal or tribal lands to lineal descendants, culturally affiliated Indian tribes, or Native Hawaiian organizations. And it provides a process for the return of those remains and cultural items. There are actually two offices in the National Park Service that address the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, and they're known as National Nagpra and Park Nagpra. It can be confusing, especially for those new to the Park Service, so I want to clarify the distinction, particularly since I will be referring to both programs at specific places in the presentation. So NPS both complies with the law and administers the law, which includes advising other agencies and museums, and that creates a potential conflict of interest. So about 10 years after the law was enacted, National Nagpra was established to administer Nagpra across all museums and agencies. So National Nagpra's role is to assist and advise Indian tribes, Native Hawaiian organizations, agencies, and museums with the Nagpra process. They publish notices, develop regulations, manage the grants program for tribes and museums, provide staff support to the review committee, and administer civil penalties for museums. Now, as a federal agency that manages public land and cares for public collections that contain remains and objects that are subject to Nagpra, the Park Service has to comply with this law. So Park Nagpra's role is to oversee the Park Service's own compliance with Nagpra. And we do that through technical assistance, guidance, and training for all NPS units service-wide. Each of the Park Service's 7 regions has designated a Nagpra coordinator. They are the first point of contact for folks in parks and other offices with Nagpra issues or questions. Park Nagpra assists and works with regional coordinators to help parks and offices meet the requirements of the law and its regulations. So compliance activities in the parks include creating and or updating inventories and summaries, assessing cultural affiliation or lineal descent, drafting, reviewing, and publishing the required public notices, responding to inadvertent discoveries and preparing for intentional excavations, developing plans of action and comprehensive agreements, completing repatriations and dispositions, and consultation about any or all of the above. Summaries and inventories are an important part of the process for items in NPS collections. These are the required documents for specified cultural items. A summary covers unassociated funerary objects, sacred objects, and objects of cultural patrimony. And it is it's a general description of items in collections that might meet the definitions for those items, particularly for sacred objects and objects of cultural patrimony. Making those identifications is largely reliant on information from tribes. The inventory is an item-by-item list, unlike the summary, which is more a general description. The inventory covers human remains and associated funerary objects. And I'm not going to get into all the definitions of those object types, and they are all defined very specifically. So completing inventories and summaries also requires public notification of the determinations made under Nagpra. This is done through federal register notices. The first is a notice of inventory completion, which only includes human remains and associated funerary objects, and a notice of intent to repatriate, which covers the summary items, unassociated funerary objects, sacred objects, and objects of cultural patrimony. Each notice describes the remains and or items, the circumstances of their acquisition, the cultural affiliation determination, and the evidence supporting it, and the tribes that were consulted. Every federal register notice goes through review by Park Nagpra before publication. What we do is ensure that these notices meet all of the legal requirements of the law, comport with national Nagpra notice templates, provide accurate numbers and descriptions, and provide sufficient evidence that supports the affiliation decisions. We also work with parks on new discoveries on park lands that occur after the law took effect on November 16th of 1990. These remains and objects are, the intent of this part of the law is that these never become federal property. We are only holding them temporarily until the appropriate custody can be determined and they can be transferred to lineal descendants or affiliated Indian tribes or Native Hawaiian organizations. We are still required to notify the public about these decisions. Instead of federal register notices, these notices are published in local newspapers. The first notice being a notice of intended disposition. I know you probably can't read that, but you can't read the whole notice, but these are examples what they look like in the newspaper. Notice of intended disposition describes the remains and items, the circumstances of discovery, the custody determinations, and supporting evidence, and the tribes consulted. And the other notice is a notice of proposed transfer or reinterment of unclaimed cultural items, which describes remains and items that haven't been transferred after a specified period of time, and it lays out an alternate proposed transfer or burial. Nagpra is also responsible for coordinating the mandated Nagpra reports. These are annual reports. There are two that are required that are related to Nagpra. First, all Department of Interior agencies are required to report completed repatriations of human remains and associated funerary objects in collections to the National Nagpra Program every year. And for new discoveries, once remains or items meet the criteria to be considered unclaimed, they must be reported to the National Nagpra Program within 1 year of the date that they become unclaimed. And we do that on a document called the List of Unclaimed Cultural Items. So this is an annual service-wide compilation and submission of both that's coordinated by my office in cooperation with the regional coordinators. And to do that, we need to be able to track all the published Federal Register and newspaper notices, the new discoveries, when the remains and items are transferred, and to whom. So here's a quick look at the current state of repatriation in the Park Service. You can see that we are in pretty good shape regarding repatriations. Nearly all of the remains and objects that have been published in notices have been transferred to tribes. The primary reason that transfer hasn't happened is that tribes or Native Hawaiian organizations haven't yet requested the remains and objects. In addition to case-by-case technical assistance, guidance for Nagpra compliance in the Park Service can be found in what's known as Appendix R. It is appendix to the MPS Cultural Resource Management Guideline, which describes all of the requirements of each part of the statute and regulations and how to comply. Park Nagpra also provides training in all aspects of the law. Both in-person classes and online webinars are conducted. Most of the webinars are recorded and are available on the internal Nagpra SharePoint site. Park Nagpra also maintains and updates that SharePoint site, which contains the guidance, all published notices, training opportunities, information, the recorded webinars, as I just mentioned, and links to other resources. So interns in the program in the past have worked on tasks such as creating, updating, and modifying the websites, reviewing inventories and draft notices, assisting with data tracking, assisting with compiling the data for the reporting mandates, researching past actions such as repatriations or transfers, assisting with training sessions, and taking notes for meetings and calls, with parks needing assistance on specific situations. So I will end it there and stop my sharing, and happy to answer any questions.
All right. Do we have any questions, Paloma?
Yes, I do see a question. Are there any exemptions? Are there any museums or other collections exempt from Nagpra?
If a museum receives federal funding in any way for anything, and they have human remains and or items that meet the definitions of the law, they're subject to Nagpra, period.
So Mary, that would be any federal funding, is that correct?
any federal funding, like, and for example, I'm trying to think of a good example that would not be.
NEA, NEH.
Right, I mean, there have been coroner's offices who, because they are part of a county or a state agency that receives federal money in some other part of the institution, if they have Native American human remains, they will be subject to Nagpra, and they are considered a museum, although they're not your standard, like what you think of a museum is. So it's not just federal funding for Nagpra, it's federal funding for anything. Any office is part of an institution that gets federal funding, that has received federal funding since the law was passed, and they have items that meet these definitions, they're going to be subject to Nagpra. I hope that made sense.
Thank you, Mary. I think you showed us how intricate Nagpra and this program can be. Mary, are there any webinars available on not a SharePoint site, something that's more publicly available?
Not from my office. Park Nagpra's internal training is only, you have to be behind the firewall of the Department of Interior to get to the SharePoint site where the recorded webinars are. National Nagpra, I believe, has some YouTube videos available on their channel. I don't have the link at hand right now.
Okay, I'll do a quick search after I ask another question for you. Does the Nagpra program assist with any other best practice standards regarding Native American materials? For example, the protocols for Native American archival materials.
No. Archival materials aren't subject to Nagpra. The paper records aren't covered. So we don't really deal with that. That would probably be, the archives or the museum program that may have some of those issues.
Okay, thank you. And I did find some webinars available on the National Nagpra page, and I will put the link in the chat. It looks like there are a number of videos, so I'll put that in the chat.
Thank you for that.
And I see another question, and this might be for you or Kim or Eric. How does the Nagpra grant funding work for tribes? How many grants are awarded to tribes each year? And that might be more for Kim. I'm not sure who can answer.
The Nagpra grants are administered by the National Nagpra program. So I don't have that information, but I do have the link to their page about their grants that should have that information there.
Yes, it looks like it's been posted. Yeah, the Nagpra grant page.
Any other questions?
Oh, there is one additional question, a general question for our panelists. In what ways does NPS have any initiatives to further best practice policies regarding Native American materials?
That's a good question.
Yeah, that's a good question. Eric, you had mentioned a recent initiative of the administration, so I don't know if there are any other initiatives.
This is Eric. The one that would come to mind would be the recent creation of, and Mary, correct me if I'm off based on this, within the Park Service of an investigator. To sort of, is this initiative? I would argue that falls in the area sort of initiative that the Park Service has undertaken to further best practices and policies, ensure compliance and this sort of thing. I don't know that he does any sort of training associated with that position, but I think that it's certainly something that especially larger institutions in the Park Service that have those collections are certainly aware of.
And this is Mary. I know that a few, or at least one region, has created like a help aid for handling materials subject to Nagpra in either in collections, how to care for them, how to wrap them, or remains in items from new discoveries while they're being cared for before they are transferred. I can't say that is like an initiative, but it's a region taking on that task to make recommendations, at least for the parks in their region. And the museum program may have some guidance as well. I'm just not up to speed on that.
Thank you.
Another thing that comes to mind, this is Eric again, is a regional initiative for us, and this is to promote and to fund, particularly through the Great American Outdoors Act. The region has earmarked some of that funding to support tribal monitors at the level of the nations. These are tribal citizens who would be on the site of archaeological work, ground disturbance of different kinds that would be able to identify and advise and consult on what best practices looks like in an archaeological context. That's a fairly, I'd say that's a very new initiative that we're still figuring out how to scale up across our region. But then just more generally, better consultation practices. I would say it's not uncommon for them to touch on Nagpra action. I think at that time, you would see consultation regarding what does proper treatment and care of ancestral remains mean. So I think just general improvement in the agency's consultation practices also contributes to that.
Thank you, Eric. This is Paloma. We have one question. I think it's for Kim. They ask, this may be a basic question. This is a great place for basic and fundamental questions. Going back to find a Thpo, when should we be connecting to a Thpo? Whenever we want to do something in coordination with a specific tribe? So Kim, when would the Park Service or any other entity find themselves connecting with the Thpo?
Thank you for the question. This is Kim. There are a whole bunch of different reasons why a federal agency or a museum or a student researcher or a professional researcher may want to reach out to a tribe. And it's always good because of our government to government relationship with tribes that if we are going to do anything that involves a tribe, that we contact them and get permission. In the majority of the United States, and Eric may choose to speak to this as a tribal liaison, but we fall under freedom of information, open records, those types of things. Because tribes have their own governments, they can establish their own laws and their own processes. So just because something may be an open record for us may not necessarily be the same thing by that particular tribe. So it's always good to check in and make sure that you have the permission to use the information, the item, whatever the case may be, to respect that relationship and to honor the fact that they have their own laws and regulations for their own information. So hopefully that helps. If I missed the mark, please let me know.
You're muted.
This is Paloma. Thank you, Kim, and thank you for that question. We have another question from Carmen. Thank you for joining, Carmen. Carmen writes, not an intern, but will be a freshman at Salve Regina in Cultural and Historic Preservation. For an item subjected to Nagpra, are museums permitted to share information about the item, even though they can't display the item itself?
This is Mary. The law doesn't address issues like that. And it might come down to the museum policies, but I would say it would be questionable to probably do that, and you would likely need permission from the affiliated tribes. I think the Park Service, we certainly don't display or shouldn't be displaying items that are subject to Nagpra. I don't know for sure if there's policy about using information, but I would suspect it is frowned upon.
Great, thank you, Mary. Thank you for those excellent questions. And I don't see any additional questions in the chat other than thank yous and that this was very informative, which it was. And I want to again thank our panelists and thank you to Julie for handling all the technology and everything that goes into presenting a webinar series. It is a lot. And Julie will share about our upcoming webinars.
Right. Thank you, Paloma. I just want to point out we have our next week's webinar on climate change, which is quite wide-ranging, and also the week after we're concluding with the Great American Outdoors Act. And I just want to point out how interrelated each of our webinars has been. We're referencing speakers we had last week in terms of tribal grants, and coming up the Great American Outdoors Act that Eric referenced. Everything relates to everything else, and I just want to point that out, the extent of these partnerships and networks that are involved in this large agency. Also, want to share with you all everybody's contact information, which I'm allowed to share, and also say that each of our panelists today would love to hear from you if you have specific questions or just want to chat about what they do in general. So here's some information about each of them. And if you want additional information, don't hesitate to contact me. I can put my contact information in the chat as well. So I want to say a big thank you to all of our panelists for joining us today. Your presentations were fascinating. And we got both a sort of a broad view about the tribal relations and some very specific information as well. It just goes to show the more that you tell us, the more we want to know. I want to also thank our attendees for asking such interesting questions. We appreciate it and welcome you to follow up by email or phone with any of the panelists or myself or Paloma. I know everyone would enjoy hearing from you. Until next Thursday at 3 o'clock Eastern, 3:30, excuse me. We will see you again then. Again, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.